Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And we're just really thrilled to be able to provide an opportunity for our alum to come back and present. And I'm excited to have Dr. Kent Tonkin join us today for the webinar entitled, "It is Who You Know, the Influence of Supervisors Over Employee Bereavement Experiences." Couple of very brief housekeeping items. I would like to encourage you to have conversation in the chat. I would like to encourage you to have questions in the Q&A. And I do believe we will be getting to questions at the end of our presentation here today. We are recording our webinar as always, and I will post that in the CTL Webinars LibGuide page. And if you do want a copy of the scrolling subtitles at the bottom of this Zoom, all you have to do is hover over your CC option in your Zoom and select Show Subtitle. So without any more announcements for today, I am going to pass this over to Dr. Tonkin.
Emily, thanks so much. And I want to start off by thanking North Central for inviting me back. I had a great experience as a doctoral student at NCU, and it's a real honor to get to present back for my alma mater. For any of our folks who are coming in today, I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you keeping your questions for the end, simply so maybe we can have some active discussion at the end. When you're addressing me, though, feel free to call me Kent. We're all friends here, and I'm just grateful that you're here. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen so we can get into our presentation for today. If I could just get confirmation that you're able to see my slides. Okay. And folks, what I know Emily is going to be monitoring the chat. I'll also be trying to be actively in there as well. If there's a really pressing question, feel free to type it in the chat, but otherwise I will be hitting those up at the end. I want to start off by thanking the Center for Teaching and Learning again for inviting me in. Emily has really done a nice job in organizing these events, and I've been pleased to get to participate in them before. So I'm really glad to be here with you all today as well. Let's start off with some introduction. What are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about the impact of bereavement at work and the ways that supervisors have an impact and the ways that people process bereavement, the way they deal with the practical aspects of it, the way that who you know as your supervisor ultimately can affect the type of experience you have when you are returning to work after or even during a loss. So let's talk a little bit about why I came to this topic in the first place. Outside of work, my interest in bereavement started many years ago. I'm a survivor of early bereavement in my own life. My own mother and father both passed by the time I was 15, and I spent a significant part of my young life navigating the world of bereavement and the lack of bereavement services at that time. When I got into my early 30s, I became a bereavement mentor in a group called the Healing Patch here in Central Pennsylvania. Got to work with kids who were in similar situations to me, and it really spurred my interest in seeing how big are the impacts of bereavement in the workplace. So what we're going to be talking about, what are we talking about? Broken legs versus broken hearts. In the United States, for example, we have something called the Family Medical Leave Act. And that means if you break a leg, if you face an illness, or if someone in your family faces an illness, you get up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to be able to take care of your family issues. We really don't have similar kinds of legislation helping or protecting people in the United States. And the question I wanted to answer was, how is that actually directly affecting people? There was not a lot of literature out there on this particular issue. When I started my literature research for my doctoral work, one of the first studies I came across was a really great study called Leave Your Emotions at Home by Bauer and Murray. And it really got into the impact that supervisors have and workplace design in general and helping people cope with bereavement at work and the practical aspects that really went into this. This led me to a research dissertation for my doctoral work, which I defended back in 2021, back in November. And what I'm going to be presenting today are the findings that are specific to supervisors. And full disclosure, I'm actually in the process of hopefully getting an article published on these very subjects. So what I'll be presenting to you today is actually pre-publication information on the impact of supervisors. Let's also tie in some additional context about why grief and bereavement is so important these days. We're in a really challenging point in our history. At this point, almost everybody we know is dealing with some kind of grief or bereavement, even if it's not direct in their own family. We've got a backdrop now. This year, we've had over 1 million COVID deaths in the United States. So in terms of awareness of grief and bereavement in the workplace, we're seeing more of that now than maybe we've ever seen. For my particular area of interest in terms of kids, estimates are we've got about 250,000 children who've at least lost one or maybe both caregivers, their primary or their secondary caregiver. That's a huge impact of this illness. At the same time, obviously, we're seeing, unfortunately, the impact of mass shootings going on in the workplace and beyond. And right now, so far in 2022, we've seen about 246 mass shootings in the United States. That ties down to about 11 per week. So people, even if it's not directly in their own families, are experiencing grief coming at them from all directions. We're also seeing now that we're hitting something that we call full employment. This might sound a little esoteric, but it really comes into something that ties into the importance of grief in the workplace. Right now, our unemployment rate in the United States is 3.6%. We're running out of people to hire. And that means that people who are working for companies are working longer hours. They're working harder. They're facing more challenges in the workplace than they did several years ago. Our labor force participation rate right now is about 62%. What that means is we've got a full 40% of the United States population that's not even trying to get into the workforce. What does that add up to for the individuals? Those of us who are working are doing more jobs, facing more responsibilities, and facing more stress. That also gives employers something to think about. How do we maintain our relationships with our employees? And bereavement is part of that. How you handle an employee who is dealing with grief means whether or not that person's going to stick with your organization, probably in the long term. That's why this kind of policy is interesting to employers. So we're going to start off with some grief trivia that we'll see, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat. We'll see how many people can get these right. How many paid days off are mandated by the federal government for all employees? So in other words, if you go all employees in the United States, how many days off are we all entitled to based on federal law? Anybody have a guess? Is it 0, 3, 5, or 7? I'm looking in the chat. We got a guess for A, and it's correct. We have no mandated federal time off for employees in terms of paid time off. There's Family Medical Leave Act, but no paid days are mandated. We're probably the only first world country to have that kind of scenario. If we go to people who do get bereavement leave in their companies, how many days of bereavement leave do you think people get? Is it 1? Is it 2 to 3? Is it 4 to 5, or is it more than 5? How many paid days of bereavement leave does the average American get? We got a guess for B, and you are correct, Crystal. You're rocking this. 2 to 3 days. Most people in the United States, if you go back to the Family Medical Leave Act, if you break your leg, you get 12 weeks off. If the love of your life dies, you get 3 days off. And so that's if you're lucky and your company actually has bereavement leave. So if we go to the Family Medical Leave Act, I kind of gave this answer already, but most people are entitled for up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. So I'll give you that answer, but here's my next question for you. True or false? The Family Medical Leave Act can be used to attend to bereavement issues after a family member has died. Is that true or false? It is absolutely false. Correct. Well done. What does that mean? You can take 12 weeks tending to a loved one who might be dying from a terminal illness, and after their death, you're no longer eligible for protected leave. And here we go. If we get into somebody who loses somebody close to them, a mother, a father, a spouse, how long does it take the average family to settle an estate? Is it A, 2 to 3 months? Is it B, 4 to 8 months? Is it C, 9 to 11 months? Or D, 12 to 24? Cheryl, you're correct. The average estate, even a simple estate, takes between 1 to 2 years to resolve. And here's the other trick. Most of the groups you're going to have to deal with in terms of deeds, in terms of death certificates, all that stuff, most of those government offices are not open during off time. So it takes a long time to do that stuff. All right, here's the last multiple choice question for you. What first world country has guaranteed leave when a child dies? It's the only country in the world that has guaranteed paid leave for parents when they lose a child or a pregnancy. Is it France, Canada, the United Kingdom, or Italy? We have a guess for B, Canada. That's a good guess. You're really close. I'll give you a hint. The Queen's important there too. Yes, the United Kingdom. The law is called Jack's Law. It just came into play 2 years ago, and all parents in Great Britain are entitled to at least a minimum of 14 days of paid leave if they lose a child or if they lose a pregnancy. And so that's what's different about these countries, but that's an outlier. If you go to New Zealand, for example, you're not entitled for paid days off for bereavement if the death happens on a weekend. They assume if the death happens on a weekend, those 2 days off are acceptable. So we've got some problems. The problem that I wanted to address through my big doctoral study was to be able to determine how are the ways that employers are treating employees affecting their ability to balance work and life. And we broke that down into 3 areas. We're looking at procedural justice, which is equity of rule enforcement in the workplace, work-life balance, are you able to balance your personal and work responsibilities, and organizational culture, the way that people regard you in the workplace. How do all these things play into the type of bereavement experience you're going to have based on your organizational culture? Now, a lot of the coming slides, I'm going to be giving you kind of a summary of my research as a whole, so we can dig deeper and get a little bit more into the areas that were specific to the relationship of the supervisor with the employee, because that ended up being the most important and noteworthy aspect. So the purpose of this study, and it was a qualitative study, was to explore the ways, again, that people who are working for companies perceive their employers' approaches to rule enforcement, to preserving the work-life balance, and also maintaining an organizational culture, whether it was good or bad, whether it was positive or negative, whether it was helpful or not. How did all of these things play into the aspect of how somebody managed the loss of a loved one? We used a really great theoretical framework. It was called the bereavement, or I should say, conceptual framework, the bereavement at work model. I was really lucky to find this framework early on. And this framework by Barclay and Kang basically said you've got 3 forces that all counterbalance each other. And when you put them together, when you put work-life balance together, organizational justice and virtue ethics all together, what you get is ultimately something that affects workplace culture. They're kind of like 3 pillars to counterbalance each other. So we've got work-life balance. In other words, how much time are we spending at work? How much time are we not spending at work? And by the way, can anybody guess? I'll look in the chat to see if anybody gets the number correct. How many hours a week is the average American working right now? If you took all people in the United States who are working, how many hours is the average American working right now? I'll give you a hint. You're close, Crystal. You're close, Cheryl. It's actually, and I see John Miko chime in, the average is actually 47 hours per week. We work longer hours than any developed country in the world in the United States. So the average person's working about 47 hours a week, and about 20% of the population is working more than 60 hours a week. So work-life balance is really tough right now. Then we get into organizational justice. We're trying to balance work and life. We're trying to also enforce the rules in our organization equitably. How we perceive that is what we refer to as organizational justice. And finally, we get into virtue ethics. Is right and wrong being applied in our organizational justice? And is that also playing into our work-life balance? Ultimately, these things combined give us our workplace culture. So that was the framework for the study. I did a phenomenological study, and for people who are not familiar with qualitative and phenomenological studies, what this essentially meant was I was trying to get a nuanced first-person perspective on what it was like to go back to work after losing somebody. In terms of the literature, there was not a lot of literature out there, meaning we needed a better understanding of the phenomena. So I chose to do a phenomenological study, and I chose to do something to be a detailed experience. When we think about grief, when we think about bereavement, it comes down to the idea that we all have very nuanced and different experiences and biases when it comes to bereavement, whether it's our worldview, whether it's our religion or lack thereof, whether it's our upbringing. It's a very specific phenomena, and it made sense to get into really seeing what people were thinking. It really was, I think, a good framework and a good approach, especially considering the other literature that was out there also was very consistent in the fact that phenomenology was still being used to explore what was happening. So what we ended up deciding to do were 1-hour individual and group interviews. And I'll get into a little bit more of the methodology. We did all of these over Zoom. Our research questions, I won't read these to you, but what we wanted to explore were essentially procedural justice, virtue ethics, and organizational culture. Those three aspects, how do those ultimately affect the individual's work-life balance? In other words, the ethics of the organization, the fairness with which people were being treated, the aspect of right and wrong and fairness of the way that rules are being enforced within organizations. How did that affect people's perception of their organization's culture, and how did it ultimately affect their work-life balance? Those were our three research questions. And so the significance of this study was there's just not a lot of information out there to be able to advise organizations on how to make fair and equitable policies. We know, for example, even though we've got Family Medical Leave Act, we're not seeing a lot of federal guidance on bereavement policy. This was left up pretty much to the employers, and my literature search showed a wide variety of policies on the parts of employers. And it was also significant to my research. I've not seen another application of Barclay and Kang's framework, and it's a pretty flexible framework and fit well with this particular subject. Well, let's talk about the terms. You're going to hear me using these terms today, so I want to make sure you understand what I mean by them. Bereavement simply means the experience someone goes through when they experience the loss of a loved one. Things that are associated with that are feelings of sadness, grief. Bereavement is not mental illness. Bereavement is a natural state for people to be in when they have lost someone. And the pragmatic aspects of bereavement can be financial, i.e., the person who died was a breadwinner in the family. They can be emotional, i.e., I love this person and now they're not here. They can be functional. This person was how I got to work every day because I rode with them in their car. An employee assistance program, for purposes of this discussion, a number of companies provide these to employees to be able to get help, mental health services, etc. So that factored into a lot of the discussion. We talked about the Family Medical Leave Act. That's a federal act that's been around since the 90s that essentially says you get 12 weeks off to care for yourself or a dependent family member, up to 12 weeks off, I should say. Organizational justice simply means how are rules being applied in your organization. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the term presenteeism, but that means people who are showing up and appear to be at work, but who are psychologically checked out. It's like absenteeism, except the employee is actually shown up. Virtue ethics simply means a sense of right and wrong that permeates our organization. And finally, work-life balance simply means, are you able to do things that are important in your personal life alongside things in your work life, and to be able to have some kind of balance? Those are our key terms. So in terms of the literature itself, I'm going to move very quickly through this part because I want to preserve time for discussion. I did a lot of research through available databases, and using the keywords we've been discussing. In reality, a lot of the information I found was not really strictly tied to bereavement. I ended up stumbling onto bereavement studies and things like HR journals or personnel journals or explorations of work-life balance more than bereavement. What that said to me is we need to be better tagging and meta-tagging our information in our studies, particular to bereavement at work. I was really fortunate that I found Barclay and Kang's framework pretty early on, and to be honest with you too, Bauer and Murray early on as well. So again, we talked about why I did phenomenology for this study. I was really lucky, again, to find the framework early on and to find some studies that use phenomenology for this type of exploration. In line with some of the other literature, the population I decided to pursue were adults, people over the age of 18 who had experienced the loss. My original sample was going to be solicited. I was going to solicit participants through Facebook. There's a number of bereavement groups on there. One of them I found had over 20,000 members. When I contacted the administrators for these Facebook groups, none of them wanted to help me. None of them felt that it was appropriate to ask for participation in research because of the nature of their subject matter. However, I was fortunate to make contact with a couple of bereavement professionals who happened to run bereavement at work groups on the LinkedIn social network. So I was able to do professional recruiting there. Some of the problem there was obviously that LinkedIn is more professional or white collar in its bias. So I also accounted for what I refer to as snowball sampling. For those of you who haven't heard that term before, that simply means that you recruit someone into the study who will then recruit someone who they know, and that increased the diversity of things like profession and background. And so again, We ended up getting data saturation in this study pretty early on. And in fact, once I had about 7 or 8 participants, we started seeing very consistent themes. So I started off with the idea of doing 23 individual interviews. Once we started getting consistency in the findings, I solicited 8 participants to be in a focus group, folks who had not participated in a one-on-one interview. That gave us a chance to verify some of the results that we were seeing. So again, the instrument I used was from Bauer. Bauer and Murray did a great article, again, I mentioned earlier, called Leave Your Feelings at Home. And Bauer herself came up with a great question framework for her 2011 dissertation, and she was gracious enough to let me adapt it for my study. I also did some improvisational questioning. The interviews went smoother the more of them that I did, and I ended up adding some improvisational questions to go along for better flow of questioning. So the procedure itself, we did all our interviews over Zoom. The very fact that this was during COVID, Zoom was very helpful. So we could safely conduct all these interviews, and it was very easy to record them with consent, with informed consent of these individuals. We did about 1-hour interviews each, plus we also did a 1-hour focus group. And we had a total of 23 participants, a lot of nuanced data, a lot of really great observations. This is just for any of you in here who might be doctoral students yourself. I used NVivo, which was coding software, to be able to go back through the transcripts of the interviews. What I essentially would do, I would rewatch the Zoom recordings, and I would go through the auto transcripts that Zoom created. I would enter those into NVivo software, and I would audit the recording transcripts while listening to them. That allowed me to get things like vocal inflection, to really capture somebody's mood, and to ensure that the transcripts themselves were correct. From there, I started developing codes. Well, this is a trend we noticed in these areas. And as I started developing codes, about halfway through the analysis, about halfway through looking at all these interviews again, the codes became pretty consistent. So after we did several rounds of code revision, we had pretty consistent coding. And again, data triangulation, for those of you who have not yet done your research or heading that direction, that simply means we had ways to have multiple types of validation. In other words, we used interview questions that sometimes asked the same question several times in different ways to clarify the information. And the focus group itself also helped us to ensure that the codes we were getting were consistent in a conversational format. The assumptions that we made is that people would answer honestly about their loss. For example, one of the inclusion criteria was that your loss had to be no more than 5 years ago and no sooner than a year ago. I go back to my own study. I think that was my inclusion criteria. The limitations were, on this format in Zoom, it's not like having a real world conversation with somebody. It's harder to see somebody's facial expressions. And we did have a couple of one drop call and some slowdown in the video, the nature of the technology. And some of the delimitations, things that maybe colored the study, again, we were limited to a professional social network. Facebook would have probably given us a wider range of participants. And again, the qualitative studies that were out there were limited by geography. It was really awesome that because we were doing an online approach, we weren't limited by that. The problem and purpose statements we came up with really were generally applicable to any kind of profession. And I also felt that a lot of the research questions we came up with were also pretty applicable to multiple work environments as well. I won't spend a lot of time on the ethical assurances other than to say I complied with all regulations of the Institutional Review Board at North Central University. And so all information was gathered and secured or gathered and stored in a secure manner, and will be for 2 more years past the time the data was gathered before I destroy it. And again, we did our best to mitigate anything like personal bias. I did that by coordinating with my dissertation chair and making sure I was discussing things with her, as well as my dissertation committee, to make sure I was not applying bias. Very important for the study, though, during the interviews, particularly for the recordings, we only used first names, so last names were not recorded as well. And so I'm going to move through some of the findings so we can get to the stuff that's specific to the employers. In terms of when I go through these findings, what comes up in red highlighter will be things that are very specific to today's theme and the effect of the employer. So when it comes up in red, that means that it's something that really applies, that a supervisor has control over an individual's bereavement. So we ended up getting 3 major themes and nine sub-themes for the research, and we found out that the influence of employers, of managers in particular, had a big impact on the way people experience bereavement. We also saw that policies themselves were largely informal. A lot of people didn't even know what their bereavement policy was at work, and they would find it out by talking with their boss. We also found out that the flexibility that you got during your bereavement was largely tied into your rank, your tenure with your organization, and your experience. And we also found that in terms of the cultural aspects, there was really inconsistent distribution of information, be it somebody knowing the policy of their organization or what their employer was sharing about them and their experience, for example. So people had varying degrees of experience based on who their supervisor was and what that person did or did not do for them. We also found out that most managers did not receive any kind of formal training on how to work with bereavement. It's kind of crazy when we think about it. We get annual training on things like sexual harassment. We get annual training on how to protect children. Most supervisors don't get any kind of training on how to work with somebody who is experiencing bereavement. We get into our third research question. The supervisor also was the person who impacted the individual's interpretation of the workplace culture and the enforcement of rules. Your touch point with your supervisor carried a lot of that. Again, how people experienced information sharing in the workplace. Any of the stuff that's coming out in red points back to the supervisor. And we also pointed out in the study, or I should say the participants pointed out, not everybody wanted support. Not everybody wanted their loss shared in the workplace. Not everybody was looking for somebody to be a shoulder for them. Some people wanted the workplace to be a place where they could check out. So we get into our research questions. Again, what were the big findings? The big findings on research question 1 was a lot of supervisors are modifying policy or just completely disregarding it to the benefit of the employee. It was consistent with the literature that was out there. The people who were having good experiences, good being a relative term, I don't mean good being the actual bereavement experience was good, because nobody wants to lose somebody, but having positive experiences with their employers supporting them comes back to either employers disregarding policy or modifying it. In terms of research question 2, we also saw that workplace culture itself played a big role in whether or not you were going to have a positive or negative opinion of your employer and the way they handle your bereavement. Were they supportive of you? Did they give you latitude to handle your grief in your own way? And finally, in terms of rule enforcement, we also saw that the ways that employers enforced rules or did not enforce rules affected somebody's opinion of their company's culture. And here's the trick. Even if you got a favorable treatment from your organization, if you noticed that somebody else you work with didn't get the same kind of treatment you did, it still changed your opinion of the organization, even if you had had a more positive experience. We're going to get into some specific examples of that as well. These are the key themes. What I just gave you was a cliff notes of the entire research proposal, the entire research dissertation. What we're going to talk about now is kind of the meat of this presentation. What particularly pertains to supervisors? How do supervisors and managers really impact the kind of experience people have with bereavement? Again, the first theme was the relationship that people have with their supervisor. Flexibility in awarding leave. Were you giving people stringent guidelines, or were you giving them a chance to walk around policy? The third theme was the way that people felt about rule enforcement in their organization. And the fourth was control of information. Let's dive into these. Let's talk about the relationship with the supervisor. Check this out. With 23 participants and about 87%, based on total responses and codes, ultimately noticed that the employer affected whether or not they were getting flexibility and the ability to take time off as they needed to deal with bereavement. So over 8 out of 10, almost 9 out of 10 participants basically said, look, this is a big deal. The biggest and most, I don't want to say strange, but something I did not see coming is that COVID-19 in many cases was actually really helpful for people who had terminally ill relatives because of remote work, and employers and supervisors in particular were more likely to allow people to flex their schedules to visit with terminally ill relatives or to spend time with people who are dying or even for memorial arrangements. So COVID-19 had an unexpected benefit of causing benefit to people to manage their schedules because we had all been put on remote work at that point. There were some other positive examples. Several employees or several participants noted that when they showed up for work after the death of a loved one, their employers actually insisted that they took time off. So we had people who were actually looking out for the well-being of their employees, even when those folks were still showing up for work. There was one very negative example, however, who was pointed out that when they showed up for work after driving 12 hours back from burying their father, and they tried to talk with their supervisor about the way that this was affecting them, the supervisor gave them a very cursory response, and the quote was, "That's too bad, hang in there." And so the impact on the participant was basically to say it was almost worse than their supervisor not saying anything than to be so dismissive of something that had hit them so hard. So that negatively impacted their relationship with their supervisor. So let's talk about the flexibility in awarding leave. Again, repeatedly, we noted that supervisors either just disregarded the rules or basically told people, take as much time off as you need. Most people who experience complicated loss, and when I say complicated loss, for example, we had one participant who had a son who died from an extended illness with cancer. We had another participant, several participants who had to close out estates. The ability to flexibly get leave, not just when the death occurred, but over the coming year to 2 years, that was everything. And their supervisors being flexible with them really made a difference. Some other kinds of positive examples, there were supervisors who allowed employees to actually visit terminally ill relatives or relatives who were in process of dying on work time. And one individual who noted that they were allowed to use counseling they had provided for COVID-19 for bereavement instead. So the employers actually looked for ways to find more benefits for employees. One of the negative examples, however, was inconsistent provision of remote work. One of the participants, who happened to be an HR director, noted that the employer would allow one person to take a laptop and work from home, while another person was not granted the same permission, even though they were in the same circumstance of grief or bereavement. This particular individual also noted themselves that they got a total of 1 day off for the loss of their mother and their father, and they were taking phone calls during a viewing phone calls and texts during a viewing service for their parent. In terms of a sub-theme that also came out because of extenuating circumstances, the terminal illnesses were part of this, but one of the things that was really a compounding issue was COVID-19, because a lot of folks did not get to have bereavement ceremonies right away. In the case of one individual, his father was dying from COVID-19 several states away, and he was remotely trying to manage his medical care while working from home, and it was very difficult. And also miscarriage. We're going to talk specifically about miscarriage being a very complicated, and I would say from my research, my very little exploration of this aspect, a completely misunderstood part about grief and bereavement. The idea of trying to manage a dying family member's pending death or their death and their arrangements during COVID was a whole other complicating factor. One of our participants, for example, did not get to have a memorial ceremony immediately, meaning they praised their supervisor and their employer for later on allowing them to take leave when the coast was clear to have that bereavement ceremony. Some of the positive examples, people reported, hey, I know I got this time off because I'm experienced, because I'm a vital member of the company, because they value me and they know I put the time in. That was all positive. The negative example was that miscarriage did not equal bereavement. There was a participant who experienced actually several miscarriages while working for a company and was denied bereavement leave, was denied any kind of non-personal time off, and was actually told, and this is, again, this is a very controversial thing, but I will report what the participant said. After reporting a miscarriage to her supervisor actually instructed her to get a D&C to terminate the pregnancy, even though that was in violation of that individual's religious beliefs. And ultimately what the supervisor did was breaking the law when it came to making recommendations about medical care, but further was also not really valuing the individual's values in terms of grief and bereavement. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's a very touchy subject. Employee perception of organizational justice, fairness. What we learned from this study is that employees who are benefiting from flexibility in the policies are grateful, but if you're unfair to somebody else in the same department of the same company, they'll still call you out on it. It'll still affect their opinion of the company. Almost universally, people who spoke about how they benefited from these policies noted very directly that they know that other people who work for the same company would not have gotten the same benefits because they lacked experience or a relationship with that supervisor. One of the most positive aspects was, for example, an individual who worked as a supervisor herself noted that her employer told her to take off as much time as possibly needed, took all the time off she needed, didn't even know about the policy, but she also still noted that she was getting preferential treatment. And a negative example was, again, we had people who were being unfairly treated based on not having the same amount, or at least in their perception, unfairly treated for not having experience. I think that the most harsh example I could think of, the individual I had mentioned who had suffered a miscarriage, not only was denied bereavement leave, but was put on a performance improvement plan the first day she came back from medically dealing with a miscarriage. So her employer felt that it was time for her to get on a performance improvement plan immediately while dealing with such a loss. So we get to the final theme, which is control of information. And what I mean by that is, how did the supervisor play a role in terms of how did the supervisor play a role in the way that information was disseminated within companies? That was really subjective. A number of participants said that they were very appreciative that their employer either shared their information because they received support, or did not share their information about their bereavement because they wanted privacy. And so the idea that a supervisor took the time to talk to the individual and find out what their preferences were, that was positively reported. One positive example was a participant reported that an all-staff email got her all kinds of emotional support and well wishes from coworkers and people who were bringing her meals and stopping by and just making sure she was okay. The negative example also was an all-staff email, and it was a person who did not want their loss publicized within the company and brought unwanted attention when what she really wanted was to be able to use her job as a respite from her grief. I'm going to give you an example of how good intentions on the part of a supervisor can blow up in somebody's face. Has anybody seen one of these before? Can anybody tell me what this is? And I'll be looking at the questions in the chat momentarily, but what am I looking at here?
I have seen this before. It's a famous sculptor. It looks like a willow tree, someone mentions. Is that right?
Yes. Actually, Michelle nailed the brand name in the chat. People love this sculpture. My wife has this sculpture. Well, one of the participants in my study who did not want her loss publicized, on her first week back from experiencing the death of her father, was called into a conference room where her supervisor gathered the entire staff to present her with this figurine in front of the entire staff. And you can imagine the impact that had on an individual who was being very private with their loss. From her reporting in the study, This ceremony cemented her decision to leave her employer, who could not regard her wishes for privacy and instead chose to make a ceremony in her honor that she did not want. This is how far it can get, where a very well-intended supervisor did not take the time to really anticipate what the employee actually wanted. So what are the implications here? And we're going to move through these quickly so we can get to plenty of Q&A and discussion. I know there's some folks in the chat who are making very, very important comments. What it comes down to, under research question 1, inconsistent flexibility and not being fair with your policies means you are going to create haves and have-nots within your organization. And although people benefit from the relationships with their supervisors, not having consistent approaches can create conflict within individuals and within your organization. What we're also seeing now is 2 to 3 days doesn't cut it. Even for a basic loss, somebody who is not leaving you in a state of complicated grief, 2 to 3 days is a minimum. And people are going to need, they're going to need time, potentially over months or years, to deal just with the pragmatic aspects of the loss. The other part of it is too, if you're unfair to one person and fair to another, even the person who is benefiting will recognize unfairness. So that comes down to the point of procedural justice, for example, and procedural and organizational justice. The idea of employee assistance programs, I will tell you this, not one person in 23 participants noted using their EAP, and that is a whole other area for exploration. And the other part of how policies disseminate through organizations, our supervisors need training on how to refresh employees on what their policies even are, and to also let them know how they want to be supported. And again, finally, under research question 3, people should be included in the discussion of how their information is being disseminated. Not everybody has the same wants or needs. Person A may benefit from the hugs and the cards. Person B may want to show up for work and use that as the place where they don't have to think about their grief. So supervisors need to be trained on these aspects and to be able to address the needs of the individual. So what are my recommendations based on this research? We simply need more leave. If you in a 3% unemployment environment, in a place where people are going through the great resignation of 2021 and are leaving employers in droves because their needs are not being met, you might want to consider if it would be important financially for your company, even if you don't care. And I hope that people who manage employees do care for the right reasons. If you want to maintain your employees, if you want retention, we need more bereavement leave for our people when they lose somebody. You better be training your managers on how to work with people who are grieving and also give them the opportunity to decide how their information is disseminated. If I were running an HR department, I would be questioning why I'm paying money for an employee assistance program that nobody's actually using, for example. Why are we paying for this if people aren't using it? And finally, this is one I did not really address a lot, but the definition of family, and actually the definition of bereavement. One of the things we're seeing is there are more people in this country are being raised by people who are not their parents or even blood relations. And in addition, I'm going to make a comment about the individual who is dealing with miscarriage. I know it's a very highly individualized topic and it's a controversial one, but I question if the employer in that scenario would have been better off simply allowing the individual to think this is bereavement to me. And even if the employer does not believe in miscarriage as bereavement, wouldn't it be worthwhile to allow the individual to make that decision and to have a policy that's flexible to allow that person to make the decision? The evidence is not there that people are abusing bereavement leave to that point. Rather than getting into an issue that is emotional, religious, and legal, why not give the individual the ability to make use of bereavement time as they see fit? So my recommendations for future research, and if this gets me almost to the end so we can finally start having some discussion, I really, personally, I'm hoping to do a larger quantitative study to take some of the findings we had on an individual level and to put it out at a wider swath to find out how big these impacts are, because I think the limitation we had was because our recruiting pool was limited to LinkedIn. I'd like to get it out at a wider basis for a wider range of professions and backgrounds. I think that the miscarriage issue is deserving of further research as well for people who are more versed in that subject than I am, though I would love to be involved in those discussions, because I think it's some place where we can really help employees. We can make better and more compassionate policies. And again, finally, if you're an employer in 2022, you should think about the impacts these things are having on your employees based on the moral argument that you should be treating people with compassion. But you should also be thinking about the financial aspect. It's really tough to recruit good people these days. Do you really want to lose them over an argument over 3 days off? And I'm going to put up my acknowledgements slide, and we're going to go to the chat. And I have not been following some of the chat, but I want to acknowledge all of these good folks who have helped me in this process, not the least of which, the most important ones are the participants who shared their stories. And I am honored they're willing to share their stories with me and to share the most terrible parts of their lives with somebody that they barely knew in some cases. All of these folks helped me in my research, and I'm also saying thank you to Emily because she was part of allowing me to share this information with you today, and all of you who are choosing to be a part of this today. I know we've got one participant in particular who had asked to share their stories as well, and so I'm grateful. I don't want to name that person until I make sure they're comfortable naming themselves, but I want to thank all of you for all of this. We're going to open it up for discussion.
And thank you so much. And Kent, by the way, the research that you're doing is so important because it's clearly an issue that needs to be discussed, and new ideas and plans around bereavement absolutely need to come to light and be an important aspect for employers as they try to attract quality employees as well too, right? So yeah, that's another piece of it too.
I always say, even for companies, if you, we hope that companies are compassionate, but even if they're not, from a pragmatic aspect, you're going to lose great people if you don't take care of them.
Absolutely. So many things in the chat. So I'm just going to kind of scroll up a little bit. This is something you talked about as well too. I'm going to start with Cheryl's comment, and then if I know Stephen popped in the chat that he was comfortable, but if you did want to speak, Stephen, you're allowed to. Otherwise, we don't have to do that here today if you don't want to. But if you did want to speak, you would need to raise your hand so I could ask you to unmute. But in the meantime, I am going to just pop in Cheryl's comment here in the chat. And for those of you who are not able to see the chat, it says, "Is not bereavement a personal and cultural issue that determines the amount of time for bereavement, and perhaps why there is not an emphasis on leave in the workplace? It should be a month to gather thoughts and regroup, in my opinion. And too many workers work in very poor conditions as well, which should also change." Couple of other things. These kind of poor conditions contribute to poor performance, then in turn has a huge impact on quality control. And she just brings up some really good points and just some of her thoughts and opinions. So I thought I would share that in tandem. Let me see here.
Well, while you're going through the comments, I wanted to share too, there are some companies who are coming up with unlimited bereavement leave and saying, take as much time as you need. Generally speaking, quick anecdote, a couple of years ago, Netflix came out with a no-fault leave policy, meaning you could take as much time as you wanted for anything. And the entire industry thought, well, people will abuse this. In reality, the exact opposite happened. People quit taking time off because they needed context to what was appropriate. How that applies here, I think it's very unlikely that most people are going to abuse a policy like this. If anything, it's going to build loyalty to the employer.
And thank you so much for that, Kent. I'm going to go ahead and ask Ellen to share. Hold on one second. Cheryl agrees. She popped in the chat based off of your comment there, Kent. Ellen, are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. With limitations in the study, you mentioned bias, but bias in relationship to what? I didn't get that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The main bias I found in my study, I originally wanted to recruit via Facebook because of the wide variety of demographics that are represented in that social network. And when I had to use LinkedIn, it's biased more toward white collar professionals. And I thought it was really important that we get a blue collar perspective as well, simply because generally speaking, those folks are more likely to have less generous leave policies. And I think some of these hardships may disproportionately affect folks who are not white collar employees.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen, for bringing that up. I'd just like to remind you, if you do unmute, please remember to mute so we don't hear any background noise. And I see Vasiki here. I'm going to go ahead and see if Vasika, are you allowed to unmute so you can share your thought or your question?
Thank you very much. I wanted to praise the presenter. Very important research and interesting research. I'm excited. I wanted to ask a quick question, or if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, you said that you did a survey through Zoom. How were those participants recruited? I guess they were recruited randomly. If yes, so how do you submit the informed consent in terms of ethical issue? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, the great part about going via Zoom was we did not need site consent. You could just do a general consent. But the way I did this, I recruited through several bereavement groups on LinkedIn. And so I posted a recruitment flyer there. When somebody expressed interest in the study, I would email them a copy of informed consent. And they would send back in writing an email that they had agreed to be a part of the study. And at the beginning of the Zoom interview, once we had scheduled the time to meet, I would reread and cover the informed consent and give them another chance to opt out if they chose not to be a part of the study. And when they verbally consented, at that point, I had both written and verbal consent for them to be a part of it. So that was how I did my recruiting. And we also did snowball recruiting, which means some of the participants who came into the study knew other people who had suffered bereavement and told them about the study and recruited other people in.
Yes, thank you. It would be interesting if the follow-up study could be a quantitative study if you have the data.
I definitely, that's my next goal, is to do a large scale quantitative study. That's my goal for the rest of my summer vacation, is to get that done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting study.
Thank you so much for your question. Okay, so a couple more things I'm seeing in the chat, and let me scroll up here. I'm just going to lower your hand, Vasiki, so I don't get confused if other people do raise their hand. Let me see here. First of all, just a couple of other comments here. Wow, thank you so much for the presentation. This is fantastic, excellent work. Another thought here, I'd love the idea of exploring giving time throughout the year, even years after a loss, because we know it really does take time to work through the emotions and the feelings of bereavement, especially if you've had more loss in a short period of time.
I agree. And one of the pragmatic aspects of that is even dealing with things like if you're closing out an estate or dealing with insurance issues. Many people lose income and health insurance during this process, and they've got to go to government agencies that are only open between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. and they don't have the time off to visit them. And so we've got all these challenges, and yeah, it's a ripple effect throughout somebody's life.
And Cheryl mentions that she's heard of Evermore, so I'm looking forward to seeing more work that you are doing here, and I'm grateful for bringing your research in our webinar series platform. Before I close out, any other thoughts that you want to share, Kent, before I close today?
Well, I put my email in the chat, and if I'll put it in there one more time just so you all have it. If there are questions or thoughts, this is my personal professional email. If you have questions or thoughts you'd like to hit me up with, feel free to do so. I'm very grateful for all of you asking questions and sharing your stories, and thank you, all of you. And Emily, especially thank you to you for inviting me and for coordinating the session. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Tonkin, again, as I mentioned, this webinar is recorded. We're going to post it in the CTL webinar LibGuide page. And thank you so very much for your time, Dr. Tonkin. And please keep me in the loop as your research progresses, because it's a fascinating topic and I sincerely mean that. So until the next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening and take care.
Take care, folks. And Emily, good luck with that doctorate.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.